And we are live. So, hello everyone. Welcome
Hello.
to
Hi.
another episode of the Podcast Junkies. I am hosting for the first time, so I'm your host, Prarthana. And every week on our Podcast Junkies, we showcased our favorite podcast and we tell you that why you should listen to these podcasts. We share with you what's hot and what's not in the podcast world. We break down each podcast for you guys. So, their business aspects, content, format, their audience, and ultimately, yes, why you should listen to it. So, in the previous episode, we talked about 3 amazing podcasts, Stuff You Should Know, AWCA, The Tim Ferriss Show. So, if you haven't checked it out, go and check it out. Do listen to it and leave some feedback also. And now let me introduce you to the rest of my co-hosts. So we have a new voice and face today. Welcome,
Hi.
Jing.
Hello everyone, my name is Jing. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, it's so good to have you here. And this is our 3rd episode. You haven't missed on a lot, so that's fine. Then just in front of me, we have Shida Osman.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Kylie T.
Hi everyone.
Yeah.
It's Kylie.
So we all are very excited and let's dive right into our podcast, the first podcast for today. So Yijing, do you want to kickstart this?
Yes. Okay, so the podcast that I'll be sharing with everyone today is actually what really got me into listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
How it began was I actually listened, it's a Chinese podcast and I listened to it on a Chinese podcasting app called 荔枝 FM. So 荔枝means lychee. So the logo is a lychee. Yeah, and this was back in I think 2015. So that's like 4 years ago. Oh, time passed so fast.
Yeah.
So back then the app was quite different from what it is now, and the interface when you enter the app it looks like a radio. So you can press next just like how you do on the radio in your car or something. So they will suggest different stations for you. So I just chanced upon this station and it's called Midnight Talks.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
That's a nice name.
Midnight Talks, yeah. Even though they don't really talk about things that's, for midnight or anything. I think it's just that the host record at midnight. Yeah. So they have real jobs, I guess. So they come together at night and then they have a little drink and then they just talk about things. So the content, are you okay, Kylie?
I'm sorry. Continue, sorry.
yeah, she's just laughing a lot.
Mornings.
Afternoon already.
Okay, sorry, my bad. Didn't look at the watch.
Okay, so coming back to Midnight Talks, the background actually is basically a couple of people who are friends coming together to chat about things, and they didn't really expect it to blow up or so. But I think how it blew up was because the few of the hosts that actually work in the music industry, so they have stories of these musicians or celebrities, and I think most people are interested in celebrities and like their untold stories, I guess, because they're friends with the celebrity. So they talk about, I went drinking with that person at this place and that place, and then just sharing stories. And then they also share a lot of music.
Okay.
Yeah, so pretty good music recommendations.
So they don't really have guests on the show. It's just the friends and they are talking and they are friends with the celebrities. So they are telling the stories.
I think the good thing about this podcast is that they have the main brand, which is Midnight Talks, right? But underneath that brand, they have a lot of different series. So there are a lot of hosts, maybe around 10 people, and then so different people come together to have different series. For instance, there's one that's specifically on like drum and bass and techno music. Yeah, so then there's a guy who's a DJ who is more of an expert in that area. So he and someone else will be talking about this, and occasionally they have guests.
Okay.
Yeah, so and then there's also travel and mostly travel, music, entertainment, these kinds. Also, like some more scandalous topics as well.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So
quite a variety.
which one will be your favorite episode out of that? Do you have something on the top of your head?
Yes, there's actually a few, one series that I really like. It's something like music of the city or something like that. A bit
Mm.
like our Sound of the City, you know. So what the hosts do for that series is that because China is really big, right? So they look at different cities in China and they talk about the music, like the contemporary music history of that city. For instance, I can't remember exactly, but for instance, like, you know, punks in Chongqing or something like that.
Oh.
And they talk about why this kind of music genre comes from the city. What is it about the city? So they're telling you a story of the city, but through music, and then they play this music and they talk about the musicians that came out of the place. Yeah, so it's very interesting to just like listen to these people talk about these things, and because they're actually sometimes friends with the musicians, so it's like just very real stories.
So there's going to be snippets of music in it, is it?
Yeah,
When
actually
telling
they're
you a story?
quite heavy on music. Like when they talk about a certain band, then they will play part of their song so that the listeners know what they're talking about. Yeah, so that's the good thing also, you know, you get a lot of recommendations.
Yeah, so you get a feel of it as well, right?
Yeah.
So is this the podcast that inspired you to start your own podcast? So
Exactly.
Jing also has a podcast.
Yes.
And do you want to give the name away?
Oh yeah, it's
I can
also
answer this. I can answer this.
Ooh, go. Do you remember?
Because I just talked to her this morning about a podcast. In English, correct me if I'm wrong, Yijing, it's actually called Forever With You.
Yes.
But in the Chinese term, I think it would be better if Yijing does it.
Yeah, so it's called 终极陪伴, which means like the ultimate accompaniment. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So that's why in English is forever with you.
Yeah, that's great. So this is the podcast that inspired you to start yours, is it?
Yes, because of the format that it is, it's a lot of you know, just a chat show, and then it's very easy to listen to, and they also mix in really well with a lot of music. So I listened to it a lot when I was doing work, like back in design school, when I was sewing and things like that. And I'll be there for like 5 hours and I get tired of listening to music. Then I'll listen to these people talk. And also when I was living alone, I guess at night sometimes I'll feel a bit lonely and like no one to talk to, and then I just listen to these people talking, so they're like my friends.
Oh wow.
Yeah, so that's the fun part, I
So
think.
they are like your companion.
Exactly.
Okay, that's great. So do you have any idea when did this start actually?
Okay, so on the app it says they're 6 years old. So yeah, I think
6
it's,
years
yeah, it's
old.
around, it's
Wow.
around there.
That's long.
That's
Yeah.
long, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do they have some numbers to give away?
Yes.
Like how many subscribers or how many
Yes.
listeners, downloads?
So let's see. Right, as of now, they have 705 episodes. Which is like quite
That's
a lot.
a lot.
Yeah, I think they went from publishing one per week to about 2 or 3 per week. So it really brought up the
Yeah.
numbers. And the total number of downloads and listens for all 700 episodes together is 5 million.
That's a good number. Yeah.
Yeah.
Over 6 years? Is it
Yeah,
over 6
over
years?
6
Yeah.
years.
That's a quick search.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have 420,000 subscribers.
Wow.
Yeah. And I mean, the good thing about these platforms in China is that they are not standalone in the sense that because I would say everyone in China uses WeChat. And you know, it's like a super app that's for chatting but also doing like all sorts of things, payments, whatever. And so there's this thing called like official accounts, which are basically you can create an account and write articles. So a lot of this, even if you're small, like obviously this bigger podcasts also will have their own accounts and they will write their articles, which then becomes complementary to their podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they can have a visual on top of the audio. Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
That is actually a whole package altogether, right?
Exactly. But the best part is that it doesn't stop there. You know, at the end of the article, you can tip them. Yeah, because WeChat also processes payment, right? So then after you read everything, you're like, okay, I like this. Maybe I can donate something.
Yeah, I think we didn't realize this kind of an ecosystem is there
Yeah.
with the article and the tipping and then the whole WeChat
interesting.
being there for podcasts. So how podcasters,
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's one
like,
whole platform.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
didn't really come across previously. So thanks, Jing, for sharing that. That's really informative. And hopefully our listeners also feel that. So let's jump into the next podcast.
Passing the baton.
Yes.
Is that me?
Yeah, Kylie. Come on. Go ahead.
Okay, so the one
Is it
I'm
another
doing on,
crime podcast? First, let me ask this.
the one
Seems
I'm
like
doing
it.
on is called The Murder in My Family.
Okay.
Okay. To be fair, the second podcast I did was not about
Yeah.
true crime.
So if you guys have actually listened to our first podcast, which was also the pilot episode, Kylie talked about Crime Junkies, and she
Yeah.
just went on and on how she's a huge fan. And to be honest, that spoke to us also, and that's why we are
Yeah.
also now hooked to Crime Junkies, I would say.
Very true.
But it's okay. So true crime, this is a different kind of
Yeah.
podcast, because usually true crime podcasts, they tell you about the story, the details and everything.
Mhm.
So for this one, actually, the host Mike Morford, he's actually a true crime writer. He's a researcher. He actually co-hosts Criminology as well. There's another famous podcast where they go
Yeah.
into the story and details. So for this podcast, by him, he actually tells the effect of murder. So he invites murder victim families
Mhm.
to come and
nice.
share their experience, during when the case happened, and even after the after effects of how they handled. And some of the families, they're still going through the trials and everything. And it's kind of like a sit down talk with them to find
Yeah,
out,
it's-
really just behind the story of just what you see on
Hmm.
the news. So it's quite different.
Yeah. So
So-
is it always the guests are there, or is it a monologue also?
It usually starts off with a story. So he tells a brief story of the murder that happened,
Mhm.
and then he will have a conversation with the murder victim's family. So it
Okay.
can be the sister, the mother, the daughter, or cousin, whatever. So it really differs. So let me just go into more details. It started off last year in July 2018. So I think this was kind of like an extra project after
Mhm.
his criminology. I mean,
Yeah.
aside from that. So he went on to this, which really touches on the personal stories of each of them. And okay, so the ads they have. So he has ads on the website.
Okay. Mhm.
So no, ads inquiries on the website. So actually people can put in whether they want to put an ad on his podcast. And then
Mhm.
he actually plays the ads at the start of the podcast.
Okay.
So he doesn't do it regularly, but he has this option for people to come to him to want to put ads. So this is one of the ways he market it on his website. Okay, and he also does his own podcast promo at the start of the podcast. So he goes on like, hey, if you want to listen to more, go on my Patreon website and all that stuff. So he does all this within like 3-4 minutes, and then he goes on to the format, which is the storytelling, the conversation with the family, and then he ends off with a shout out to another podcast, or
Mhm.
even to people who has donated, who has subscribed and all that stuff. So he does it in quite a structured way.
Mhm.
Yeah, his podcast is about 20 minutes to 1 hour long.
Yeah.
And yeah, so he really talks to them. And I think one of the good points of this podcast is that it's different from the typical one. And it's also quite, I don't know, when I listen to it, I feel quite, not say affected emotionally, but I feel very connected. And I feel like I understand what he's saying and what the relatives on there are saying, and you don't really get to hear this on the news or on radio or even on
definitely everything
Yeah.
is scripted.
Yeah,
Most
or-
of the things are
yeah.
scripted, right?
And even when you listen to true crime podcasts, they only tell you what happens, but you don't hear it from that person's perspective.
Mhm.
And it really tells a whole other story other than the murder itself,
Mhm.
And I like the fact that this host, Mike, he's very empathetic. So he doesn't just chase them for the details. He really really goes through the whole
Yeah.
event with them. He asks them, how do you cope with it after that?
Mm.
And he's really very understanding. And there's one recent podcast that I just listened to, as in recent episode.
Mhm.
It's about one where this lady, she was 19 years old when she had her second or third child, and he was only about 2.5 months old before he was murdered. So it's really a very touchy subject. It's quite a sad thing, and
the way he goes on to interview her and all that stuff, he was very understanding. He was really finding out what's all the feelings behind what happened and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think to some people that kind of hits a chord because we all have families, you know, we have not we, but they have children, and it really touches them in that way.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think it comes back to the point that we were also discussing in the previous episode that okay, a lot of things get reported and a lot of things, articles and stuff is
Yeah.
out there, but podcasts are a great way to tell the story behind the story.
Yeah.
So even as like just Jing said that, you know, there's articles supporting the podcast and stuff like that. So it's very necessary. I think podcast adds like a more long form story,
Yeah.
going in depth into a conversation. Plus, obviously, empathy is plays a huge part in it.
I think touching on interviewing as well, I think it would be very hard for the Mike, right?
Mike,
His
yeah.
name, yeah. I think it would be very hard because you're directly communicating with the victim's family
Yeah.
itself. So I think I'm gonna listen to that. It's an interesting take on how, because you don't know how you. Yes, it's empathetic. You have to be empathetic, but to
Yeah.
touch and dive into the subject
Gotta be
would
sensitive about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be
Yeah.
interesting.
How did you come across that podcast? I know you're a huge fan of, like, we all know now that you're a huge fan of true crime podcasts, but how did you come across this particular one?
I'm just always finding, you know, when I search true crime, I'm just looking through the titles and everything. So this one really caught my eye, and that's what is good about podcasts, as in about his podcast, because it's something that catches you and stops you. You know, there can be so many of a similar kind of podcast, but the title actually kind of makes a difference.
Yeah.
You know, you're like, oh, the murder in my family. What can you know? And then when I realized what he's talking about, I'm like, oh, then I got hooked on it. And the thing is, honestly, when we kind of listen to true crime podcasts or we even watch true crime shows, we don't kind of relate to it. But when we hear the relatives, you know,
Yeah,
they're
it's
really
first-hand experience.
and they're
of-
kind of like the victims of the murder as well. So when you hear it, you're like, oh, that can really happen to anyone. It sounds
Yeah.
like someone, you know.
Yeah.
So I feel like his podcast is really good that it touches on things that we wouldn't think of, and he goes really deep and personal, and yeah.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you also said that the podcast is like long, like from 20 minutes to all the
1
way to
hour,
1
yeah.
hour. I think that is also very necessary to set the scene, especially in true crime podcasts. First 20 minutes is usually
Telling
about
of the
setting the
story, yeah.
scene and telling the backstory, and then getting the guest on,
Yeah.
and then letting them speak whatever they
Yeah.
want to, rather
Yeah.
than putting questions out to them that, okay, these are the questions I'll be
What
asking
happened?
you.
Tell me how you feel. Yeah.
Tell me this.
Yeah.
After listening to this podcast, I felt that it is more about the flow of the conversation was very natural,
It's
and
more
it
of
was
like a conversation, and I
Yeah.
feel like in some ways it would be kind of like a therapy for them.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like speaking about it, because
Speaking all
I don't
about
think
it, yeah.
people actually dare to ask when such things happen. And even for some recent events, some that are unsolved, it actually helps them to get it out there, and people with, you know, information or whatnot, they can actually come and help and give in tips and all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you said it in a very nicely with the therapy part, that when
Yeah.
usually such instances happen, I feel, because there's news here and there all
Yeah.
over, like even the person is so lost
Yeah.
that person doesn't know, but few months or years down the line, they go through the whole phase of acceptance. So this adds like a huge way to know,
Yeah.
tell the story out there, that what
Yeah.
happened, where are they now, not just for the listeners, the ones just to make sure that, you know, they don't go through this, but also to the ones who have gone through this.
Yeah, to the other victims.
To the other
Yeah.
victims, it's like an online support group, to be
Yeah, it
honest.
is, yeah.
They're learning from each other
Yeah.
and how to cope up. Somebody is already few years
Yeah.
down this grief path, and the others are maybe something recently happened to them.
Yeah, it's like a
Yeah.
support,
True.
sort of a support group podcast.
Mhm.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
So do check that out. Yeah.
Yes, Kylie, very convincing. Thank you, Kylie, for that. Shida,
Hello.
hello. How are you this morning?
Doing good.
Okay.
Doing better.
Do you want to jump into your podcast?
Yes. So I'm so gonna listen to the previous podcast, which is
Yeah.
by
The
Mike.
murder in my
The
family.
murder- I'm going to say that because I think it's interesting. Anyways, my podcast. So the one that I'm going to feature this week is called okay, before I put this, let me just say I'm a nerd. So this is why.
You are.
Anyway, thanks. So the podcast is actually called Hidden Brain.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually by NPR, National Public Radio. If you guys don't know about that, please Google that. Or I
Yeah.
can explain to you. It's actually an
If
American
you-
private funded.
If you don't know about that, you should know about it. The reason is because we'll be talking about a lot of their
A lot.
podcasts.
Yeah.
They have set some benchmarks in the
Very
space
true.
of podcast world, so you should definitely check it out.
And they
yeah.
have really good quality podcasts.
Amazing. They go on and beyond to prove and experiment with content and
Yeah.
formats and everything. So they have literally set a benchmark for all of us.
True. Very, very true. So, where was I? Hidden Brain. Yes.
Mhm.
So it is actually produced. It's not produced. The content wise is actually narrative is actually by Shankar Vedantam. Forgive me if I got the name wrong. He is also a social science correspondent with NPR. I think I had this conversation with Jing earlier this morning that I'm interested in philosophy and psychology
Yeah.
and social science as well. So, Hidden Brain, the first episode was actually in August 9th, 2015, originating
Yeah.
from Washington, D.C. And the term behind the name Hidden Brain is it's coined to describe a range of influences that manipulate human beings without our awareness.
Oh.
Let me just do a little bit backstory that okay. When you do just as simple as when you go to a grocery store, you came there with an idea of buying, for example, a broccoli, right? But when you go there, you want to buy a broccoli, and then you see an apple. Why do you choose an apple? Those are the things that you can't explain. Why are you choosing an apple instead of the broccoli that you initially wanted to actually choose? So that's the whole content for Hidden Brain is the things that subconsciously makes your brain make the decision. So speaking of that, I've gone through how it started. Let me go into content. So content wise, it's you guys should really listen to it. I'm telling you guys, it's interesting as hell because my backstory to it is because whenever I listen to podcasts, I always want to learn something new instead of knowing, there's always repetitive news all over podcasts like, hey, this happened, that happened. It's everywhere. You can find it on Instagram, Facebook, and everything else. So for the content, there's topics like switch tracking, which is, I have it on a slide here. The explanation of that is switch tracking means when somebody gives you feedback, your reaction to the feedback changes the subject. That's one topic. And then the other topics would be the science of fear. Another one would be why no one feels rich and the ostrich effect.
Okay.
Does it entice your...
Yeah, the
Yeah.
concept seems to be, even the title seems to be very interesting.
Right.
So I would definitely want to hear what it's about. Like even the ostrich effect. Like
I
what
want to
the-
know why no one
Yeah.
feels rich because I don't feel rich.
You know why? You know why? The reason, just a small backstory behind that as well. That topic actually, why no one feels rich, is because as human beings, it's naturally that we compare ourselves to people who have better things.
Okay.
We don't compare ourselves to people who don't have things. So that's the gist behind that. And the ostrich effect, if I may, is the concept of I actually have the explanation here. The concept of intentionally tuning out any information that may include painful news or information you don't want to hear, whether distressing current events or TV spoilers.
Shida, just putting it out there, you have just proved that you're a nerd. The amount of research you do and everything is out there. You have your notes ready, you have your laptop ready.
Nerdy. It's true.
So-
Like quantum, I think the main subjects for me would be science or religion because that's the two things that can actually have a good debate topic. Anyways, so I think I should go into format. So the formatting for Hidden Brain is actually they survive heavily on research. If you really listen to it, it doesn't only talk about the topics that Shankar actually, wrote. They have game shows. They have mini game shows in it with their own NPR staff just to actually have a trial and error of why that topic works. Like why, for example, Shankar would actually carry experiments on
Okay.
his, but game show experiments, not
Yeah.
experiments like guinea pig experiments, but experiments of why, for example, he's talking about the broccoli and the apple, right? The one
Yeah.
I was telling you about.
Yeah.
So he would do that in a game show with his colleague itself
Oh.
in that topic, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Which is interesting. It's
Should we try?
yeah, because
Yeah. So
They-
it's like experiment.
yeah, it's like experiment. It is an experiment, and we
to
don't.
prove the topic
Yeah, so that is during the podcast. is
during
it?
the podcast.
And you never know what the result is, but I think Shankar is very confident.
He is. And the thing is, it's in between takes of him telling the story of the topic and also the game show as well.
Yeah.
And then he seamlessly comes back into the topic itself.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yeah, and
Interesting.
that's very interesting. So they started in 2015, not very long back.
Yeah.
So how many episodes do they have? Do we have that number?
I think now I don't have an exact number for it, but I think
How many have you listened
700. Probably about less than 20.
to? Okay.
Yeah, to be
Yeah.
really honest. Less than 20.
700? Did you say 700?
Yeah, I think more. I think more than
That's a
700.
lot, actually.
Within
Loads.
4 years,
Yeah.
700 episodes. And how long are each episode?
The numbers on it, I think it varies from. He tries to make it not sweet and short, but it ranges from probably 45 to 1. He doesn't go
Yeah.
above the 1 hour
Yeah.
time from what I have.
Yeah,
I might
that's
got
a
it
sweet
wrong,
spot,
but yeah.
Mhm.
But that's the timing. For numbers wise, marketing wise, his let me just get a slide here. Instagram 14K.
Mhm.
Listeners and people who are watching this, I suck at numbers, so forgive me.
I'm gonna help you.
Facebook is 54K. Twitter is 124K. He has no YouTube channel.
Okay.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
Castbox subscribers 444,000.6K. Did I get it right?
No.
401. Is that 4 million?
No, it is 444.6K.
By the
But yeah, it's 444,000. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right.
By
Yeah.
the third, the podcast junkies, people will be like, okay, Shida is not the one to go to
She's
for
a
numbers.
nerd, but she doesn't know numbers.
You can come to me about science, religion completely, or quantum physics. I'm completely okay with that. iTunes rating 4.5/5 rating.
So
it's
4.5 out
Oh.
of 5 rating.
sorry guys, afternoon haven't eat, so yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah.
Sheena, you need your coffee dosage in the morning itself.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's very. And how did you go about? Like, how did you find this podcast?
What same as teaching as well. This was one of the podcasts that I
Mm.
based my podcast on.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually, the ideas come from various podcasts itself, but this was one of them.
Okay.
Mm.
Very interesting. So we discussed 3 different podcasts today, and we started with the Jings. It was all about the different kind of an ecosystem that is built, and obviously the number of episodes they've done. 6 years.
For
Yeah.
for us, mine was about the same as she does.
Yeah.
So 2015, about 700
Yeah,
episodes.
2015.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to share a bit
Mm.
more about in terms of marketing and monetization.
Mm.
Yeah, for the podcast that I was
Mhm.
sharing, Midnight Talks. So just now I was talking about the WeChat articles, right, and how people can tip.
Yeah.
But I think that's not. I don't know how much they make from that, but I
Yeah.
wouldn't assume that it's a lot of money.
Mhm.
But for most of the Chinese podcasts I listen to, they don't usually come with advertisements. So
Mhm.
no ads or anything at the beginning, at the end. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that it's pretty much all consumer.
Yeah.
Like powered by the consumers. But I think also sometimes the platforms itself can sign on to some people and give them some money for putting out content.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So, sorry.
No, I was just saying that is maybe another reason why it's more like an hobbyist format rather than somebody doing it full time, because you said right, most of them have a full time job.
Yes, so I think they actually made a switch kind of halfway through too, because they were getting traction. There were a lot of people listening to it. So they did want. So now I think I'm not sure if it's exactly their full-time job, but I know they definitely put more time into it. And how they make money is actually, you guys were talking about was it the stuff you should know? Was it
Yeah,
that show
Stuff
that
You
like
Should
people
Know.
they have
Another
like,
nerdy one.
that they have live shows, right?
Yeah.
So for them, they don't really have live shows per se, but because the hosts have their own personal brands. Like they have different different series and different people, like different hosts. So they get all these hosts together and go on like a tour within China, and then they meet the fans in a restaurant, and then they all have dinner together. And they also, what they do now is kind of like a travel agency. So for instance, they talk about the Fuji Rock concert, and then they will be like, okay, we're gonna bring some of you guys to go to the concert. So they do the whole package. Like we get a visa for you, get tickets for you,
It's like an
accommodation.
experience thing.
Exactly, and like that's where they get the money now, I think. Yeah,
That's very interesting, because there are different ways how podcasts are getting monetized. Sometimes individuals are using it just to upsell themselves, their services. Similar to, I think, and the others are getting it from advertising, and the others like us, they're like the podcast media house where they're creating podcasts for brands. So that is a very interesting perspective, definitely. So thanks, Jing, for sharing that. And Kylie, obviously your podcast, and we talked about how it is completely within true crime also, because I think there are a lot of true crime podcasts out there.
There are a lot, and not all of them are like business kind of podcasts.
Yeah.
Quite a lot is for like for non-profit to promote it, and also, like I said, to promote the cases and to get in more tips for the cases, because I mean, when something happens, like an incident happens, people forget about it over time, but it kind of bring people back again to the event, because you can move on, but they are not moving on. So it really brings a lot of attention back. And sometimes it's not just about marketing and, earning from the podcast. Of course, they do that along the way with ads, so as to support their research and to support the whole podcast that they're doing. But mostly for true crime, it's more of like to raise awareness and to bring attention to the cases and to those non-profit organizations as well. So it's very interesting how many different ways a podcast can go. Yeah.
And then Shida, we
Hi.
talked about your podcast, and obviously the whole research that you have put together.
But it's interesting to find out how, like, once again, like what goes into podcast is marketing and content and everything else. But I guess it boils down to what the intentions of the initial podcast is, as we always do it weekly. It's always different podcast itself. Like for mine, social science. For hers, it's true crime. For Jing, it's much more of entertainment and music and stuff like that, you see. But I think as a whole, to summarize it, there's no... How should I put this? There's no exact textbook of this works, this doesn't work.
So you
it's
have
going
to
be ever
try it
changing.
out.
Yeah.
I think that is one of the reasons of the Podcast Junkies also, because we already have some set taste, because we have our favorite podcast, right? But then we are learning from each other, because I was never into true crime podcast, but
Now you
now
are.
after now I'm definitely I'm
She's a
getting
fan.
there.
We are going to CrimeCon.
Yeah,
once again.
we have decided that we are gonna go to CrimeCon, so the Podcast Junkies will be there whenever that happens next in Asia.
Waving to the camera right now. But it's also another thing, it's interesting as well how Yijing actually brought out the WeChat marketing. I
For
think
sure.
because what we're trying to do with the Podcast Junkies as well, we're trying to connect the gaps of why, not that it doesn't work out in Asia, like how is it that in America and in Europe it's huge, but in Asia we're trying to connect the dots of what we can learn from and try to apply it.
Exactly. And
So the WeChat idea is really good.
Yeah, also what can we take from there, but also maybe what is different and probably wouldn't work here. Maybe people respond to different forms of marketing.
Yeah, so we are all learning here, and we have learned a lot today. We have learned about
Very true.
different kind of content. So we talked about content which is more focused on entertainment and music, then another
True crime.
podcast, true crime. Yes, that is reserved for you. And then we talked about social science. So, and people are listening to it. You have numbers. We have shown numbers to you. So do check out these podcasts, and then we'll be back with another episode next week. Thank you.
See you all.